Here is something you have looked at your entire life without ever really stopping to think about. Human skin comes in an enormous range of colors, from very dark brown to very pale pink, with every conceivable shade in between. It varies by geography, by ancestry, by individual, in ways that are immediately visible and that human societies have spent thousands of years assigning enormous meaning to. And yet almost nobody actually knows why. Not in the biological sense. Not the real answer. Most people have a vague sense that it has something to do with where your ancestors came from. Hot places, dark skin; cold places, light skin; sun protection maybe. And that is sort of in the right direction, but it misses almost everything interesting about the actual story. Because the real story involves a molecule that is simultaneously protecting your DNA and destroying your ability to make a vitamin your brain needs to function. It involves a single gene that accounts for most of the skin color difference between entire continental populations. It involves the fact that European populations were almost certainly dark-skinned until shockingly recently, in evolutionary terms, and that the change happened faster than almost any other physical trait in the entire human record. And it involves the uncomfortable but genuinely fascinating fact that skin color, the characteristic that human history has treated as one of its most fundamental dividing lines, is one of the most genetically shallow differences between human populations that exists. A thin layer of evolutionary paint applied very recently over a much deeper and older shared biology. That is what this is about. To understand why humans have different skin colors, you have to start at the beginning, and the beginning is Africa. Every human being alive today, regardless of their current skin color or where they live, is descended from ancestors who lived in sub-Saharan Africa. This is not a cultural claim or a political statement. It is one of the most robustly supported findings in all of modern genetics. The genetic diversity within African populations dwarfs the genetic diversity found in the rest of the world combined, which is exactly what you would expect from a species that originated in Africa and then spread outward, with each migrating group carrying only a subset of the total genetic variation. And those original African ancestors, the common ancestors of every human alive today, were dark-skinned. We know this because of what dark skin does and why evolution would have produced it in the first place. Dark skin is not a starting point that was later modified. It is an adaptation, a solution to a specific problem posed by the African environment. And to understand that problem, you need to understand the molecule that creates skin color in the first place. That molecule is melanin. Melanin is produced by specialized cells in the skin called melanocytes. Interestingly, all humans, regardless of skin color, have roughly the same number of melanocytes. The difference is not in how many melanin-producing cells you have. The difference is in how much melanin those cells produce and what type. Melanin comes in two main forms: eumelanin, which is dark brown to black, and pheomelanin, which is red to yellow. Dark skin has high concentrations of eumelanin. Pale skin has less eumelanin and proportionally more pheomelanin. Red hair is a specific variation in pheomelanin production. The entire visible range of human skin and hair color comes from variations in the ratio and quantity of these two molecules. And eumelanin, specifically, is one of the most effective natural sunscreens that exists. It absorbs ultraviolet radiation from sunlight before that radiation can penetrate deeper into the skin and damage the DNA of living cells. In a high UV environment like sub-Saharan Africa, sitting directly under the equatorial sun for most of the year, high melanin production is not an aesthetic feature. It is critical biological infrastructure. But protection from UV radiation is only half of the story, and the other half is more surprising. Here's the piece of the skin color puzzle that almost nobody talks about, and it is arguably more important than the UV protection argument. Ultraviolet radiation does not just damage DNA directly. It also destroys folate. Folate, also known as vitamin B9, is an essential nutrient. Your body cannot synthesize it. You have to get it from food, or your body degrades it from existing stores. And folate is not optional. It is essential for DNA synthesis and repair, for cell division, and most critically, for the development of the neural tube in early pregnancy. The neural tube is the embryonic precursor to the brain and spinal cord. Without adequate folate, neural tube defects occur. Serious developmental problems that are often fatal or severely disabling. In other words, UV radiation destroys the nutrient that is essential for making functional human brains and spinal cords. This was the specific evolutionary pressure that drove the development of dark skin in our ancestors, not just the risk of skin cancer from UV damage, which tends to occur after reproductive age and therefore exerts weaker evolutionary pressure, but the much more immediate and reproductive age relevant risk of UV radiation, depleting folate stores in pregnant women, leading to failed pregnancies and developmental defects in surviving offspring. The research that established this connection was largely developed by Nina Jablonski, a biological anthropologist whose work on skin color represents one of the most important contributions to the field in the last several decades. Her argument, supported by a significant body of evidence, is that dark skin evolved and was maintained in high UV environments, specifically because the folate protection it provides is directly linked to reproductive success. Dark-skinned individuals in equatorial Africa lost fewer pregnancies to folate deficiency-related neural tube defects, raised more healthy children, and passed on their genes for high melanin production at higher rates. The mechanism is elegant in its brutality. Sunlight is energy. That energy is useful. It powers photosynthesis, it warms the planet, it drives the water cycle. But for unprotected human DNA and unprotected human folate stores in high UV environments, it is also destructive. Dark skin is the biological solution to that destruction, a molecular parasol maintained across millions of years of evolution, because without it, you could not reliably make healthy babies. For most of human prehistory, the folate protection story was the whole story. Humans lived in Africa under high UV conditions, dark skin was maintained by strong selection, and the variation in melanin production that existed was relatively modest. Then humans left Africa. The first significant migrations out of Africa began somewhere around 70,000 years ago, though there is evidence of earlier smaller dispersals. Humans moved north and east, into the Middle East, into Central Asia, into Europe, into East Asia. And as they moved away from the equator, something important changed about their environment. The UV radiation levels dropped. At higher latitudes, sunlight arrives at a lower angle. It passes through more atmosphere. The UV component is significantly reduced, especially during winter months. In Northern Europe or Northern Asia, during winter, UV levels can be so low that meaningful UV exposure is essentially impossible for months at a time. And here is where the trade-off becomes critical. UV radiation is not only a threat to be blocked, it is also the trigger for a process that is essential to human health. UV radiation hitting the skin triggers the synthesis of vitamin D. Vitamin D is not really a vitamin in the traditional sense, it is a hormone precursor, and it is essential for calcium absorption, for bone development, for immune function, and for a range of other physiological processes. Severe vitamin D deficiency causes rickets in children, a condition in which bones fail to mineralize correctly, producing skeletal deformities. It is associated with immune dysfunction, with increased rates of certain diseases, and with impaired fertility. In a low UV environment, dark skin becomes a problem rather than a solution. The same melanin that so effectively blocks UV radiation in high UV Africa also blocks the UV radiation needed to synthesize vitamin D in low UV northern latitudes. A dark-skinned individual in Northern Europe during winter may not be able to synthesize meaningful amounts of vitamin D at all from sun exposure, regardless of how much time they spend outdoors. This is the evolutionary pressure that drove the development of lighter skin at higher latitudes. Not aesthetics, not climate in some vague general sense, but the very specific metabolic trade-off between folate protection and vitamin D synthesis. In high UV environments, you need lots of melanin to protect your folate. In low UV environments, you need less melanin to allow vitamin D synthesis. Evolution found the local optimum in each environment, and the result is the global variation in human skin color that exists today. Here's where the story gets genuinely startling, and it is the part that most popular accounts of skin color get completely wrong. The lightening of skin in populations that migrated to higher latitudes did not happen slowly over hundreds of thousands of years. It happened fast, astonishingly fast by evolutionary standards. Ancient DNA studies, the analysis of genetic material extracted from prehistoric skeletal remains, have produced findings that were, when they first appeared, genuinely shocking to the scientific community. Studies of ancient European hunter-gatherers from as recently as 8 to 10,000 years ago found genetic signatures indicating that these individuals were almost certainly dark-skinned or significantly darker-skinned than modern Europeans. 8,000 years ago. To put that in perspective, that is after the construction of the earliest megalithic monuments in Europe. People were already farming in parts of the Middle East. The human populations of Europe, in the period that mainstream popular history tends to think of as the dawn of European prehistory, were probably not pale. The genetic changes that produce the light skin characteristic of modern European populations appear to have occurred largely within the last 6 to 10,000 years. Some researchers have suggested the changes were even more recent and more rapid than that. The spread of agriculture into Europe brought new populations from Anatolia, whose genetic variants for lighter skin became widespread relatively quickly. Further changes were introduced by migrations from the Eurasian steppe during the Bronze Age. The result is that the pale skin of modern Northern Europeans is, in evolutionary terms, a very recent development. Not a primordial characteristic, not an ancient heritage, but a rapid adaptive response to a specific environmental challenge that occurred within a time frame that is genuinely recent, even by the standards of recorded human history. And this brings us to the part of the story that is perhaps the most important, and certainly the most counterintuitive, for anyone who has grown up in a world where skin color has been treated as one of humanity's most fundamental divisions. The genetic basis of skin color variation between populations is surprisingly simple. A single gene, SLC24A5, accounts for a very large proportion of the skin tone difference between populations of European and sub-Saharan African ancestry. One gene, one genetic variant at one position in the genome, that became nearly universal in European populations within the last several thousand years, accounts for more of the observable difference between very pale European skin and very dark African skin than almost any other single genetic change. The total number of genes that meaningfully contribute to skin color variation across all human populations is relatively small. Current research suggests somewhere in the range of a few dozen genes that have detectable effects on skin pigmentation. For a trait that human civilizations have treated as one of their most significant categories of human difference, the genetic architecture is remarkably shallow. To put this in perspective, height in humans is influenced by thousands of genetic variants. Intelligence, whatever that means at the genetic level, involves enormous genetic complexity. Susceptibility to most complex diseases involves hundreds to thousands of genetic variants interacting in ways that researchers are still working to understand. Skin color, by contrast, is genetically simple. It is a single-layer adaptation to local UV environments, driven by a clear and well-understood metabolic trade-off that happened rapidly in response to environmental pressure and that sits on the very surface of the enormous genetic complexity that all humans share. There's also another remarkable wrinkle in this story. Different populations that developed lighter skin did not always do so through the same genetic changes. European populations lightened through specific genetic variants. East Asian populations, who also live at higher latitudes and also developed lighter skin than their equatorial ancestors, did so through partially different genetic pathways. The same evolutionary pressure, the need for vitamin D synthesis in low UV environments, was solved by different genetic means in different populations. This is called convergent evolution, the same outcome reached by different routes, and it tells you something important. The similarity in skin tone between, say, Northern Europeans and East Asians is not primarily a result of shared ancestry in that trait. It is a result of both populations independently solving the same environmental problem. So, why do humans have different skin colors? The honest answer is that it is an evolutionary response to a specific metabolic trade-off between two essential nutrients, played out across geography, driven by the physics of how UV radiation behaves at different latitudes, and implemented genetically in ways that are far simpler and far more recent than almost anyone assumes. Dark skin protected the folate stores essential for healthy reproduction in high UV equatorial environments. Lighter skin allowed sufficient vitamin D synthesis in low UV northern environments. Evolution found the local optimum in each place. The result is the global range of human skin color. It happened recently, more recently than most people assume. The The populations whose descendants now have very pale skin were almost certainly significantly darker just 8 to 10,000 years ago. The change was rapid, driven by strong selective pressure, and involved relatively few genes. And those genes represent a vanishingly thin layer of biological difference. Underneath the melanin, underneath the eumelanin and pheomelanin ratios that determine where on the visible spectrum your skin sits, the genetic similarity between any two humans chosen at random from opposite ends of the visible skin tone spectrum is extraordinary. The differences that determine skin color are real. They are biological. They are the product of millions of years of human evolutionary history responding to the demands of different environments. But they are also among the shallowest differences in the entire human genome. A few genes, a few thousand years, a thin coat of evolutionary paint applied quickly in response to a very specific environmental problem over a shared biological foundation that is hundreds of thousands of years older and far more deeply shared than the surface variation that covers it. Human skin color is not a deep biological division. It is geography. It is latitude. It is the angle at which sunlight arrives at the surface of the planet. It is the body's answer to a very specific question about UV radiation and two essential nutrients. Everything else that human history has built on top of that, every hierarchy, every category, every meaning attached to the surface variation, is not biology. It is a story humans told about a molecule. And like most stories humans tell about molecules, it turned out to be considerably less accurate than the molecule itself. Like and subscribe if you enjoy these videos. I'll see you in the next one.